Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Digital Law News, produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK. I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're just going to run through some news stories which are coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Amelia. Hello, everyone. My name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director of Digital Law, and it's only the second week of the year. At one point we were thinking, well, we're going to have an awful lot of stuff to talk about, and it turns out that I think there's enough stuff we're going to be talking about in this episode that would probably make our top 10 of the biggest stories of the year. Even though we've got another 11 months of the year to go. So I will pass back to you so we can get into some of the massive fines that are being levied and some of the other big developments that are happening.
Thanks, Peter. So our first stop this week is with Google and Facebook. So if you're a regular listener, you will know that pretty much at least once a week we will mention Google or Facebook, or maybe even WhatsApp. So France has fined Google and Facebook over cookies. So the data privacy watchdog CNIL has said both sites are making it difficult for internet users to refuse the online tracking cookies. This story is all to do with consent. So I will pass over to Peter to talk about this one.
Thank you. Yes. So I've actually just opened up here on the CNIL website the official notification of these fines. You know, the press release that confirms what they're doing. Because given the size of the fines, there's not an awful lot that they're actually saying. So big news is we've got Google being fined 90 million euros for Google LLC, the parent corporation, and then 60 million euros for Google Ireland Limited. So therefore 150 million euros as a whole, and then another 60 million euros for Facebook Ireland. And this is all over the vexed issue of consent. Now, everyone will hopefully be familiar with the fact that everyone usually associates consent with things like GDPR and Article 6. It talks about specific informed consent as being one of the legitimate basis for processing data. Well, when it comes to cookies, that's actually governed at a European level through the privacy, through the old e-privacy directive, which is now 20 years old as of 2022. It was 2002 that was first published and then enacted through various regulations in different EU member states. So in the UK, that was through the Privacy and Electronic Communications regs, and that continues to be the case. But point here is that CNIL, the French data protection regulator, has seen fit to say that Google and Facebook are not complying with the basic requirements around how cookies are put onto users' devices. They're not happy with the fact that sometimes, and this is the quote from the French regulator here, they say, several clicks are required to refuse all cookies against a single one to accept them. So they're making it very easy for you to accept all these cookies being put onto each user's device, but making it quite difficult, quite restrictive for you to click through and say, no, I don't want all of these cookies. There's a very good reason for that, because Google and Facebook do gather an awful lot of information through the use of cookies on their platforms. And indeed, that's how they then go about bringing in a lot of the data that they use in order to use for profiling, in order to use for target advertising, to carry out a lot of the behavioral analysis that they then undertake using a mixture of AI, various algorithms, etc. So this has been established practice, and as far as CNIL is concerned, they're doing this because they aren't happy with how cookies are currently handled when you go to Facebook, when you go to Google, or indeed when you go to YouTube, YouTube being part of Google's ownership online, of course. So that's the size of the fines, and they've said basically that these corporations now have a period of 3 months in order to amend the way that they deal with consent, and if they don't end up implementing a system of consent that the French regulator is happy with, they will then continue to fine them 100,000 euros per day, every day, until the problem is rectified. So what's the so what? What are the big takeaways from this? I think the first thing is that an awful lot of corporations out there very often look to companies like Google and Facebook as an exemplar, and they'll go, well, when I go to Facebook, they do this when it comes to handling consent, when it comes to various data protection practices. And they say, well, if Facebook and Google are doing it this way, that's the way that we think we should operate. And if Facebook and Google are doing it that way, or indeed getting away with it that way, many companies think, well, we will follow and we can therefore do the same practices. And if they're doing it, surely we can do it. Is that, I'm afraid, the usual lemming mentality? Just because one person's jumped off the cliff, it means the rest of us can then follow without sort of thinking or applying your own level of scrutiny. So these are companies that I say an awful lot of others will follow. Second thing is that this is now numerous times now that CNIL have fined Google, and it's interesting that while under GDPR you have the idea of the one-stop shop, the idea that you have a single data protection regulator that you speak to. So, for example, Facebook, its HQ for Europe is in Ireland, where all the infrastructure is, and that's certainly where all the decision making is, which is the comparator that GDPR is looking for. So the idea is that if you are operating in multiple jurisdictions in Europe, wherever you've got your HQ, wherever you're making decisions with regards to processing, that is where you will be regulated from. And therefore, an awful lot of big tech companies, Facebook, Google, Apple, are all regulated through the Irish Data Protection Commissioner. The point here is that that still hasn't stopped them being clobbered over the head for a fine from the French data protection regulator in this instance, who is saying, well, you're breaching the French Data Protection Act, and as a result, they are therefore applying this fine. Google and Facebook have said they are going to appeal, so they aren't certainly going to take it lying down. So it now remains to be seen what the outcome is of that appeal process. But one of, I think, of our siren calls last year was to say, look, there's simply not been enough enforcement by any of the European data protection regulators when it comes to GDPR, or an awful lot when it comes to data protection and privacy. Whenever you look at the ICO, they're doing lots of fines for cold calling and automated calls and this sort of thing, not doing an awful lot when it comes to GDPR. So perhaps January is signifying that the regulators are saying, yes, we do have teeth, we're going to issue large fines, and we're coming after the big tech giants for hundreds of millions of euro.
Exactly, and it'll be interesting to see whether the appeal is kind of accepted there from Google and Facebook. And no doubt, I'm sure we'll talk about Google, Facebook, and the other kind of big cheeses of the tech world in episodes to come. So our next story for this week is to do with Apple AirTags. So this is kind of a three-tiered story. Initially, it was brought to my attention when I was going through TikTok. So this lady had found an Apple AirTag in her pockets, and this happened to be Sports Illustrated model Brooks Nader, and she had been being tracked using the Apple AirTag for 5 hours. And while this is kind of the on the surface story, if you have a look at Googling just simply Apple AirTag news, you will get a slew of stories that come up. So I'll pass on to Peter to go through a few more of these that have been going through the news headlines.
Yes, thanks, Amelia. This is a really worrying and scary story. So the Apple AirTag has been developed as a product, the idea being that you can put these little things, which are about the size of a coin, size of a thumbnail. You can put these onto a phone or in a bag or an item of property so that you can know where it is. In theory, it means that the days of losing your car keys are long lost. However, it unfortunately doesn't take a particularly big leap for then this technology to be used for nefarious purposes. And there's been reporting in the Daily Mail, New York Times, various other publications of these tags being found on people, i.e. people who've been out. You find this in your coat, or in another story, one had been put underneath a car seat. So it wasn't as though it was just put into the car bumper. Someone actually found it under the car seat. Or another story, it had been it was a tag that had been secreted externally on the vehicle. Either way, the point here is that they are being used to tail people, to follow them. yeah, unfortunately, this isn't a path that you then want to particularly go down when you think, well, what could be the consequences of that? It means that people can be traced from where they may have been out socially back to their home. They could be traced from where they've been in numbers to when they're then somewhere then vulnerable. If it's a vehicle, it could be that you've got car thieves who will then seek to break in and steal that vehicle once it's parked in the street or outside a home. Or it could be used, to then specifically track a individual to their home and then to where they're going to be more vulnerable. And I won't colour in the picture any more than that, but I think that hopefully gets across the point that this technology could mean that people are significantly more at risk than they otherwise would be. I think it's then a matter of thinking about, it's almost like, unfortunately, the genie's been let out of the lamp, because this technology means that routinely, therefore, people can be traced, can be followed in a very sophisticated manner fairly easily. I should add that the whole idea with these AirTags is that apparently if they are then a distance away from the user, or they are removed from the original user for a period, it should then start to reach out to other phones, to other handsets, to say, hello, I'm an AirTag, here I am. And indeed, after another period of time, it should then start making a noise so that it becomes apparent that it's there. But apparently it can be many, many hours until this happens. So one of the people who found this on their vehicle said it had been following them for 5 hours until they noticed on their phone that there was this AirTag saying it was moving and it was nearby, and it was actually on her vehicle. So therefore, the potential for it to be used for tracking purposes is very, very clear. It is now going to be a matter of seeing, well, what do Apple do to correct this problem? In this story alone, there's three documented instances that it talks about where users have come forward, and then another story that talks about it being used by car thieves. So already, clearly, this technology is out there and people are using it for these purposes. What are Apple going to do to minimize the risk? Do they even see that they need to minimize the risk? Let's face it, they've introduced technology in the past and said, here it is, and they've put it to the market, and it can be used to bully, harass, and intimidate people, and they've not done anything. Will they bother this time? The ball's in Apple's court. I think, though, that it'll be interesting to see that while this technology is freely available in the US market, does it remain as easily available and on sale in other jurisdictions? Let's not forget the horrific My Friend Kayla doll, which brought the world of surveillance of individuals into children's bedrooms. So therefore, in Europe now, the only example of the My Friend Kayla doll with its Bluetooth and cameras and microphones that you can find is in the East Berlin Spy Museum, because that's where this sort of technology really, if we're brutally honest, belongs. So let's see what happens. Is the use of this sort of technology clamped down on in certain jurisdictions? And indeed, what happens then in that big market in the US? Do any individual states decide to do anything about it? Does anything happen at a federal level? Again, I wouldn't hold my breath. So let's just see if Apple sees the need to show some leadership here and take the product off the market, or heavily update or amend it.
Thanks, Peter. It'll be interesting to watch and see what's happened, particularly where this story is kind of, everyone knows TikTok now. It is very widely used, and it's so easy to reshare this. And particularly from that perspective, it is a lot of bad press that's going to be coming. So it'll be interesting, like you said, to see how Apple reacts, or if they react to this, in fact.
Yes, it would like to see if the public react with their wallets and just don't make enough purchases of this to make it technology that's worthwhile or profitable. That would probably be, to be perfectly brutally honest, the best thing that could happen. And I think that we'll just have to, we'll have to deal with continuing to mislay our phones and keys and retrieving them the old-fashioned way. I think the risk is a little bit less, don't you?
Precisely. I mean, crikey, I'd definitely far likely use my keys than be tracked or stalked from someone being able to see my location.
Exactly.
So moving on to our next story. So this is from the NCSC weekly threat report. So shopping platform Pulse TV has disclosed that more than 200,000 users may have had their credit card information compromised in a data breach, according to reports. So the company had indicated to the customers that the e-commerce platform between November 2019 and August last year may have been affected, with potentially compromising data such as full names, email addresses, payment card details, the lot. So I will hand over to Peter to continue with this one.
Thanks, Amelia. Unfortunately, this is another example of a fairly significant breach. UK-based online store, Pulse TV, has had more than 200,000 credit card transaction records breached here. It looks like this was between November 2019 and August of last year. So during the pandemic, when, surprise, surprise, everyone was buying an awful lot of stuff online. And of course, with it being November 2019, that means that GDPR will apply. So who knows, there could be an investigation and there could be regulatory enforcement by the data protection regulator in the UK, the ICO. As always, though, it's a matter of looking at the guidance here, and the NCSC saying, you know, look out for any, check your credit card bills. Has there been any unauthorized activity? Is there anything happening on there that that shouldn't be? And the platform itself, Pulse TV, is now implementing things like two-factor ID. And one of the things we are forever telling our clients, and one of the things that the NCSC is hammering and hammering and hammering, is to say the more that you have two-factor or multi-factor identification as standard on a system that you have to use before you can log in, the less likelihood that you'll have a breach like this. So for all of you out there, entrepreneurs, tech firms, tech startups, if you're building and you've got an idea of some great new system, great new app, make sure you're integrating multi-factor ID from the outset. It's a great security feature, and there's less likelihood of you getting terrible negative publicity like Pulse TV are now going to do because of a breach like this.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to a similar story. Over 1 million accounts have been compromised by credential stuffers. So New York's General Attorney Letitia James has announced an investigation into credential stuffing had uncovered 1.1 million compromised customer accounts linked to 17 well-known companies. So credential stuffing is a cyber attack where stolen user credentials, usually usernames and emails, are used to make automated login requests. So, and then the stolen user are typically data breaches and attacks, and they're using other people's email addresses and stuff on other sites and websites and services. So I will pass on to Peter to continue with this.
Thank you, Amelia. And again, this is an example of a significant data protection breach in the US this time, but it's interesting that it is targeting and making particularly vulnerable all those users out there who use the same password or the same email account across multiple different accounts. Now, yeah, it's likely that we're all going to probably use probably the same one or two email addresses as an ID on accounts. But it's where we end up using the same password that it causes real problems. They call it daisy chaining, because in effect, you've then got the same login and password for multiple different platforms, and then all it uses, I mean, this credential stuffing will be using a artificial system, an AI powered piece of kit to then proceed to use the same login and passwords on multiple different platforms just to see if they can, if the hackers can then get in. So it's an incentive really to make sure that you are not using the same password on multiple different platforms. And this comes back to the usual advice: don't use the same password. Always vary it. Always throw in and make it difficult and confusing. So the more non-alphanumeric characters, the more sort of things like, you know, the dollar symbol or the pound sterling symbol or the euro E, or putting in a number or a hashtag or the @ symbol. or an ampersand, the more things like that you throw into your password, the better. Not to mention the longer password. So sometimes is it not so much a matter of doing a password as a passphrase. Could be a song lyric, could be a song title, could be the name of a favorite TV show. Who knows? Because stuff like that, funny enough, is easier to remember than just one word, but it can then ensure that it makes something more difficult for automated systems like this to hack. But clearly, credential stuffing is going to be on the rise as login and passwords end up being hacked and then used easily by hackers in this instance across multiple different platforms. So we need to be alive to these sorts of threats. And again, the same advice as we just had for the previous story, multi-factor ID. So two-factor identification or multi-factor ID, where usually it involves text message or something else being sent, and or the use of an app, just so that you can have that extra layer of security. If that's on there, it means that it's impossible for these sorts of actors to therefore gain access using these sorts of systems, but otherwise the damage they can wreak can be quite significant.
Thanks, Peter. That links quite nicely into one of the previous stories we'd done last year in regards to the most common passwords, and you'd be surprised how many people still use password as their password. And it's like going back to what you just said, Peter, using phrases or song lyrics. I love movies, as does Peter, and one of my favourite passwords to use are movie quotes from random movies, and I just use my favourite quote as the password, because I mean, you know, who would sort of think to put a movie quote as a password, and it's quite personal to yourself and it's something you'd remember. So it's definitely a route to go down.
Yes, maybe I should just change all my passwords to "Go ahead, punk, make my day" or something like that. Who knows? But you're quite right. Yes, just pick some phrases are always much more easier to remember, and you'd have to write them down is the key thing as well. I know some of the guidance that the NCSC's put out said, "Oh, use a password manager," but I always tend to think, yeah, putting all your passwords together in one place, you know, it kind of reeks of being somewhat dangerous as well. So certainly we do not recommend, we never have and never will be recommending the use of password managers for that very reason.
So moving on to our last story today. So this is from the European Data Protection Supervisor, and they've instructed the law enforcement agency Europol to delete personal data of individuals who have no established link to criminal activity, concluding an inquiry started in April 2019. So the EDPS initiated the inquiry based on concerns that Europol's data processing activities were going beyond its mandate and breaching its data protection rules. I will pass over to Peter to kind of go through the main principles of data protection that are kind of in content here.
Thanks, Amelia. So this story is really a little bit of a tip of the iceberg, and I think we're going to see a lot of stories around this theme in the course of the coming year. We have seen an expansion in recent years of state security services collecting more and more personal data on individuals, not necessarily those who have been charged or convicted, but sometimes just people who might be arrested but not charged. Very often all that information is collected. So in the UK, certainly there were issues with regards to the fact that anyone who was arrested would end up having DNA samples taken, and a big DNA register was created. And in certain instances it's helpful because, of course, then there could be a ping somewhere, and it could be that DNA that's been in a cold case for the last decade suddenly shows a match with someone who may have just come through the system. So there can be benefits to doing this. Indeed, there was a serial killer who in France who was recently unmasked and ended up killing themselves before they could be arrested. And it turned out they were in fact a police officer, and they've been responsible for a series of murders through Paris. And it was only then, I think, through cold cases and data being collected that suddenly they realized the pattern and realized who it was many, many years after indeed decades after these events had taken place. So you have to have the potential public benefit there balanced against mass retention of personal data by the state on individuals that really should they be having their data retained and processed, particularly if they have, as the EDPS has said here, for individuals who have no established link with criminal activity. So, you know, particularly for those who might indeed never have been arrested, it could be that they've just, for whatever reason, provided information at certain points, and that's then been collected, used by the police, profiled. I mean, say, for example, it's just someone who was a witness to something. Say it was just someone who reported an incident. Is it then fair that all, that personal data should then be collected, retained, and processed on those individuals if they have, as I say, no established link with any criminal activity? So there's significant ethical issues around this, let alone the legal issue of when we look at the general principles within European data protection regulation of data minimization, i.e. you only collect the data that you need, not to mention data retention. You only retain it for as long as it's necessary, and you only collect the data that is strictly necessary in the first place. So indeed, it's going to be a matter, therefore, of going through. And as far as the Guardian newspaper who have published this story, they've said that currently there's probably 1 million gigabytes worth of data, not 1 million records. Bear in mind, a gigabyte is a huge amount of data. There could be tens of thousands of records inside 1 gigabyte. So 1 million gigabytes is an awful lot of data, and clearly here where the EDPS is saying to Europol, who will then probably have to trickle this notification down to individual police forces as well, to sort of say you should not be collecting this data or retaining it routinely. It's a bit of a change for the police. I mean, let's face it, it's for some countries where you might have police that are struggling for funds, struggling for time. There may be the usual refrain of, well, shouldn't we be out catching criminals rather than spending time complying with this? But I think that there comes a point where you've got the balance between general civil liberties for the population versus the need to catch the criminals. So this is always an issue that's going to go on, but certainly the EDPS, for its part, is trying to make it clear that this sort of data shouldn't be being routinely collected and processed.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our last news story for today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and we'll be back next week. So just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, podcast channels as well, such as Spotify and Apple Music. So thank you for listening, and we hope to see you next week.